Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to this wonderful session on Incoterms knowledge session, which has been organized by AMTOI along with My Logistics Gurukul. Over to our convener, Mr. Harish Lalwani.
Good afternoon, everybody. We have about 140 participants as we start this. It's exactly 4 o'clock. Yes, 4:01. So yes, thank you all for sparing your valuable time to join us for this session. The numbers look very encouraging and thank you for all that. So welcome all. I don't want to take too much time. I would like to go straight to introducing our speaker for today. So yes, I would like to go straight to introducing our speaker for today and of course our team. So I am now going to move out of this particular presentation and the presentation of the speaker will then come in. Yes, so now about our speaker, Shri Indrajit Das. Indrajit Das is a maths graduate from University of Delhi and has done a certificate program postgraduate in business management from XLRI Jamshedpur. He comes with 30 years of experience in cargo and logistics. He has served Air France, KLM, Cargo, Cathay Pacific Airways, and DHL, and is presently associated with the Skyways Group since 2017, managing the air freight procurement and the Far East cluster for the Global Logistics Division. Indrajit is a trainer on the panel of My Logistics Gurukul, my apologies, and regularly conducts training on Incoterms, pricing, procurement, and basics of air freight. At this moment, I also need to mention that our sincere thanks to My Logistics Gurukul to share with us their knowledge session. And thank you, sir. I may now ask you to please begin the session.
Thank you, Mr. Lalwani, for the kind introduction. Hi, friends. Good afternoon to all of you. I am Indrajit Das, as Mr. Lalwani has already briefed me on this session. So we will be, doing a little bit of a knowledge-based. We are planning a knowledge-based session, and I'm sure this session will be quite effective for you. So after the session, definitely we will take your feedback, how it went, and where do you want us to improve. So I'm straight away going on to the session itself. So I'll just start my screen sharing with all of you so that you can all view the screen.
My one humble request to all the participants, please put your questions only on the question answer box. Do not put it on your chat. We're trying to compile it so that end of the session, after Indrajit finishes a presentation, we are able to take up the questions. So please place your questions only on the question answer box. Thank you.
I'm sure everybody can view this screen which I have displayed here. I'm going to minimize a lot of things here so that everything is available for you. Okay, friends, good evening to all of you. In fact, we are tending towards the evening, and it's a Friday evening, so we will not take much of your time, and we'll try to finish up this session as soon as possible. And so good evening to all of you once again. So today's topic is Incoterms 2020. So what I could see from the list of our friends who have joined on this session is that most of you are from the logistics and supply chain industry. So it's very good to know that we are fairly conversant with the movement of the goods. But for some interest of some people who are, for the benefit of some people, we will be discussing a little bit of, the basics of Incoterms 2020 also, so that it is clear to all of us. So Incoterms 2020 before Incoterms 2020, I would like you to take you to the past, where it started in 1919, where International Chamber of Commerce, they were having a tough time during those post World War area, how to decide on the movement of the goods. So they wanted to bring economic prosperity. So there were people like industrialists, and there were financiers, and there were traders who sit together and brought these Incoterms into place. So the Incoterms, the first Incoterms was published in 1936, and we are talking currently about the Incoterms, which is the 9th edition. Incoterms 2020 is the 9th edition, which now we are at present. So there has been a lot of revisions in the Incoterms, and year on year, like over a decade, like from 1936, then 1953, because there were a lot of war. The Second World War started, and there were a lot of issues which happened. And after 1950, again the group rejoined back, and then there were a lot of rail transportation which started moving. So 1953, there was the first revision which happened with additions of certain rail transportation Incoterms. So Incoterms is basically it's actually derived by the International Chamber of Commerce, and it's a baby of International Chamber of Commerce, and they brought the companies, the parties all together into one platform, and which is why it is known as International Commercial Terms. So, and in today's date, just for your reference, 40 million parties or companies are participating, and it is prevailing in 100 countries. So the basics of Incoterms 2020, why this Incoterms 2020 came in, because there were a lot of changes which were made in Incoterms 2010, and prior to that there was Incoterms 2000. So a lot of changes were thought, and it took almost 2 years to draft down the Incoterms 2020. So it's been it takes a long time. It took a long time. So Incoterms 2020 states about how the movement between the exporter, the goods. We will talk about the movement of the goods out here. So it basically describes about streamlining the trade between the exporter and importer internationally and nationally. And it was International Chamber of Commerce who introduced these shipping terms, Incoterms, which is acceptable in every country. Like I just told you that in 40 million, around 40 million companies are using Incoterms, and it is spread over 100 countries. So Incoterms has been explained in a set of 11. There are 11 Incoterms which are there, so which we'll be discussing one by one, and they are commonly used as a 3-letter code, which is being reflecting business to business practice in the contract for the sale and purchase of goods. So when we talk about sale and purchase of goods, like the exporter is selling and the importer is buying, so the movement of the goods, which we will talk about in the next few slides. So what does Incoterms 2020 do? Like it talks about the responsibility, defines the responsibility of seller and buyer, and just 1 minute. Yeah. Okay. Why do we need Incoterms? So the Incoterms are required because although we talk about like we have a common term which is used in global trade tariff. Most of us know that we use harmonized codes, harmonized tariff codes in cargo. For customs tariff we do. So Incoterms rules are also global, like the harmonized tariffs are. So what does Incoterms do is, Incoterms basically defines the responsibility of seller and buyer concerning the movement of the goods, concerning the supply of goods. and Incoterms is acceptable worldwide in international trade. As I have already told you that it is available in 100 countries, plus the same codes are being used, so it is acceptable worldwide. So the Incoterm rules helps importer and exporter around the world to understand their responsibility and avoid costly misunderstanding. The rules form a common language of international sales, transactions, and help build confidence in our valuable global trading system. There are certain more information like it also constitute a common language for international traders. Like we are sitting in Delhi, or somebody is sitting in Hyderabad, or somebody is sitting in Chennai. They are talking the same language when we talk about these terms. And even when you are trading, when we are discussing with our overseas counterparts in any countries, any part of the world, we talk about the same language. It also will specify the division of risk and cost between the exporter and importer. At a later slide, we will discuss more about it. How does it work? Who will be responsible for what? The seller is responsible till which area of his, and the importer will be responsible for where the risk will get transferred, who will pay what. All this will be discussed. Now, what does Incoterms do? The Incoterms basically we will majorly talk about these three things in our Incoterms. One is the obligation, the second one is risk, and the third one is the cost. Now, when we talk about obligation means who does what as between seller and buyer. Like, for example, who will pay for the carriage? That is an obligation. Who will obtain the shipping documents? Who will obtain the export or the import license? Or who will organize the insurance of goods? These are the obligations which we will be discussing. And then we will be also discussing this is what Incoterms 2020 will be talking about. And the risk, like where the seller will deliver the goods, at the warehouse of the buyer designated place, or at the port, or at the destination port. So all these things will be discussed there. And they also the risk, where the risk is getting transferred from the seller to the buyer. So these are the components which Incoterms 2020 states about the obligation, about the risk, and the cost. Now, when we talk about the cost, which party will be responsible for the cost? Like, for example, who will do the packaging? And then who will do the transportation, buyer or seller? Who will do the loading and unloading? The cost we are talking about. Who will pay for the cost? So all these things are in Incoterms 2020. This is what Incoterms will be done. So friends, Incoterms is basically a kind of a guideline. So we will discuss about this in what the Incoterms don't do. Now, Incoterms, they don't apply automatically, right? Now, when we say automatically, Incoterm rules are not in themselves, and therefore they are not substitute for a contract of sale, right? And they are revised to reflect trade practices. The transfer of owner of goods or the payment terms between buyer and seller, this will not change. They are separate. Incoterms doesn't do that. Now, if you want the Incoterms to be there, then we have to, there is a contract of sale which happens. So basically, it is basically to revise to reflect trade practices for no particular type of goods, and they can be used for, these Incoterms are basically used for bulk cargo of iron ore, or if we discuss about any container movements from of say any commodity, or any pallet movement of flowers. So Incoterms will discuss about that. So these are matters for which the parties need to make more specific provision in their contract of sale. Now, for example, if they want to put the Incoterms as a guideline, then they have to specify in the contract of sale. So the essence of the Incoterms rules are not by themselves. if it is only applicable if it is, you know, put in a correct manner in the contract of sale. That is what we all should remember. Now there are 11 sets of Incoterms which we are discussing out here, right? So in Incoterms 2020, these are the Incoterms which have come into place, and there are 11 sets. And we all know that they are grouped in 4 categories: E, F, C, D, which was formed in 2010, and that's how, you know, Incoterms are being discussed. So when we talk about in the next slides, we will show how these Incoterms are being placed. Now, when we talk about the rules or modes of transportations, there are 7 Incoterms which are being used currently, and they are these 7 Incoterms: XWorks, FCA, CPT, CIP, DAP, DPU, and DDP. Right. So these 7 Incoterms are being used in Incoterms 2020 for any mode of transportation. Out of the 11, we are talking about the 7 here, where the 7 Incoterms are being used for air, sea, road transportation, wherever or the rules. These are the modes for which these 7 transportations are used. So 7 of them are written here, and the remaining 4 of them are the 4 are only for sea and inland. So when we talk about the Incoterms 2020, the 7 of them which we discussed on the earlier slide are only for any modes of transportation, and these 4 are exclusively for sea and inland waterway transportation. They don't apply to the air transportations. Only for sea and inland water transportation these are applied. So I just want to go back to the previous slide just to give you a guideline. These are all 3-letter codes where we can see here all 3-letter codes, which is DPU, DDP. They have been mentioned. But when if we look at them, FCA is free carrier, CPT is carriage paid to, CIP is carriage insurance paid to. That is how they have been derived into the 3-letter code, right? So now, how do we best incorporate the Incoterms rules? Now, Incoterm rules are best derived in this manner. The chosen Incoterm rule, for example, if we write down XWorks, we write down XWorks. Then we write down the name, port, place, or point, Incoterms 2020. That is how an Incoterm should be written. So, friends, it is very, very important that whenever you are applying and whenever the seller and the buyer, they agree on a certain movement of goods. See, Incoterms is basically to facilitate the seller and buyer, how the goods will move from point A to point B. And which is why these Incoterms have been written. All these 11 Incoterms which have been given have certain definitions which the seller and the buyer will choose. So when they choose and they want to incorporate the Incoterms, then it has to be written in a specified manner. So this is the specific slide where it is written: the chosen Incoterms rule, name, port, place, or point, and the Incoterms 2020. Now, for example, if you have a shipment CIF to Shanghai, so you should write down the chosen Incoterms tool as CIF, name port as Shanghai, and name place as Shanghai, and Incoterms as 2020, right? So this is how an Incoterms is replaced. If we talk about, say, for example, you're sitting in India and you're sitting in New Delhi, or say you have a customer in Gurgaon, so, and they want to use, and the seller said, no, the buyer has agreed for XWorks terms. So you will put it as EXW XWorks, the name, place where of delivery, where the seller will drop the goods, that is his warehouse, which is in Gurgaon, and Incoterms 2020. That is how the Incoterms are incorporated out here. Now we come to the next, the first Incoterms, which is XWorks. Now in Incoterms XWorks, we clearly see here, yeah. Okay, on the screen, I just want, here you see it's very clearly, it's a diagrammatically representation which has been provided. So in this, you can see that there is a seller and he is actually, here we have the buyer, okay. Now, there is some movements which are happening from the seller point of origin to the place of destination at buyer's end. Now, for example, if we take any example, like I just gave an example of the buyer deciding on an X works terms. Now, the name place of delivery, say we say Gurgaon, or say we say Pune warehouse in Mumbai, or we talk about Chennai. So if we put as X works Chennai Incoterms 2020, so the seller, what will the seller do? The seller will be only responsible for packaging, labeling at the point of origin. That is what is the seller responsible. And then it is the responsible of the buyer to pick the goods from the seller's warehouse till the point of destination. So whenever Xworks is being Xworks is comes into play is when the buyer doesn't have any such kind of its offices in at the origin most of the times. So which is why this kind of situation comes in. So the buyer nominates the forwarder, and the forwarder then goes back to the seller and then does all the kind of movement. So in this scenario, we are looking at, if you look at the diagram, the transfer of risk. Now, what happens is when the buyer places the goods at the warehouse, now it is the buyer who is responsible for loading of the goods onto the truck. And for example, if we are talking about Chennai warehouse of the seller, the buyer will be loading the goods into the truck. It's the buyer's responsibility, not the seller's responsibility in Xworks. So friends, which we should always remember that it is the buyer, it is responsible for loading the goods into the truck at the origin and transferring them to the main carrier. So from the point of origin, from where the buyer is just placing the goods, it is the seller is placing the goods, it is the buyer's responsibility to pick the goods and place it and then bring it to the destination. So the risk itself is getting transferred at the seller's warehouse itself, where the seller is placing the goods. The transfer of risk and cost. So here in this slide, if you look at it, the seller has minimum obligation because he has to only place the goods at the warehouse, whereas the buyer has the maximum obligation. So if we come to the next point, we will just show you what happens as a common mistake. As in this slide, there is an invoice cum packing list which we receive as a freight forwarding company. We receive from our seller or the buyer, and when we get this information, if we notice there is a highlighted point X works. Now X works it doesn't suffice when we put it in an invoice. It should be put in a proper correct manner. Now this is a shipment by air which is moving from Mumbai to Chicago, so it's an X works. But how does the Incoterms is represented? That is more important. So Incoterms should be represented in this manner. X works, road number 4A, block gate number 6, Udyog Bihar, Gurugram. This is the address, the warehouse of the seller, where the name place of delivery, where the shipment has to be picked up by the buyer. So that has to be mentioned. And India Incoterms 2020 rules. Now, this is very important for us to know that the Incoterms 2020 rules has to be always mentioned. Because if we don't mention Incoterms 2020, then at the court of law there can be lot of arbitration, lot of other things can during arbitration, lot of other complexities can happen. So which is why the 2020 should be mentioned with the correct Incoterms used for which Incoterms have been used. So Incoterms 2020 is quite should be put on the invoice. It should be clearly mentioned. Now we will talk about the major heads for charges, the cost part. In a ex works charges, the buyer has the maximum obligation. As I said, the buyer has to pay everything. So from the pickup of the goods from the seller's warehouse till the destination, the buyer is responsible for the cost. So if we talk about origin, if we talk about destination, it is only buyer. So buyer has the maximum obligation in ex works cost. Now, when we talk about freight collect, when we talk about the freight, it is collect here. Like we talk about the cost at the origin, it is the buyer. When we talk about the destination, it is the buyer. And when we talk about the freight, it is the buyer. So the points which we should remember in an ex works is that the freight terms is always collect. We talk about the freight, it is air and sea, because in ex works terms can be used in any of the modes of transportation. So freight is always collect. Buyer, as I said, is maximum obligation, because buyer has to take the maximum risk is of buyer. Because when the seller places the goods at the warehouse of its own, it's the buyer who has to take the responsibility from there. Loading at the seller warehouse is not required by seller. It is not necessary that seller has to load it. So this is a very vital point which we should remember in an ex works terms. And the risk will transfer from shipper to buyer once the goods are handed over at the name place of delivery at origin. When we talk about name place of delivery, as I was giving some example on the Chennai warehouse or the Pune warehouse or the Gurgaon warehouse, that is the place where the shipper is placing the goods, where there the risk is getting transferred from shipper to buyer. So the buyer is at maximum risk. So friends, these are the 4 points which we should remember in an ex works term. These are the 4 major points. Now we come to the F terms. We discussed about the E terms. Now we come to the F terms. Now in F terms, we have got 3 terms which are majorly in use in Incoterms 2020. And they are FCA, FAS, and FOB. These are the 3 terms which will be in use. Now, when we talk about FCA terms, FCA is, there are 2 options given in Incoterms 2020. So we will discuss about the 2 cases here. One is the name place of delivery will be the seller premises. And in the second case, we will discuss about the name place of delivery as not the seller premises. So if it once, so we are here in this slide, we will be discussing about the first case of FCA, where the name place of delivery is seller premises, which is again the same as the ex works, where we are discussing that the seller is placing the goods at the seller's premises. But in an FCA carrier, how the things will work, it will be a little different from the ex works. So how is it like in FCA? Again, the packaging, labeling, everything is done by the seller. But here in FCA, the goods are loaded by the seller. In an ex works, the goods are being, it's not necessarily that the goods will be loaded by the seller. But in an FCA, where the name place of delivery is seller premises, the seller loads the good. The sellers will do the export customs clearance also. So in ex works, the seller was not doing all these activities. In a FCA, the seller is doing all these activities. So the transfer of risk, so the will get is again at the seller's warehouse only. The transfer of risk will be at the seller's warehouse. So the seller will do the loading of the goods, will do the export clearance, customs clearance, but the risk remains there at the seller's warehouse, and the buyer is responsible. The buyer is at risk here. When we talk about the buyer arranges the transportation to pick up goods from seller's premises and transfers them to the main carrier. That is how the buyer will work here. So again, the buyer will ask the freight forwarder to pick the goods from the seller's warehouse, and the seller will work it out. Okay, so here we can clearly see that it is this also FCA carrier is again it is applied to 2 modes of transportation. All the modes of transportation, if we talk about ocean, if we talk about air, in both the cases FCA is applicable. The buyer and seller can use this term. So the points which we should remember in an FCA free carrier is, okay, now, sorry, we didn't cover the other one. So the second scenario is when the FCA, when the name place of delivery is not seller. So in this, what happens is, like, for example, there can be a scenario that the customer says, the buyer says, no, you drop the goods at the forwarder's warehouse at the airport or the seaport. So the seller does that. Sometimes the buyer can say, okay, you drop it at the respective ICDs for ocean, or if you talk about the hinterland port, so the seller will do that. So this is that same case FCA which we are discussing. So in this, what happens is the packaging, labeling, the loading, the export customs clearance, everything the seller organizes here. And also the seller is, dropping the goods at the warehouse of the buyer designated place, not the seller premises, but the buyer designated place. For example, the buyer says, I've got a warehouse in Pune and you drop your goods at my warehouse. So at that warehouse where the seller is dropping the goods, there the transfer of risk and cost is getting changed. So buyer is responsible for transferring the goods from the named place to the main carrier in the second case. So in an FCA free carrier, the points which we should remember is freight has to be collect, buyer has maximum obligation. As we have seen that the buyer takes has to pick up the cargo from the seller's premises in the first case, or from the warehouse, origin warehouse office to the freight forwarder nominated warehouse to the destination, and the seller is responsible for customs clearance at origin. Now in Incoterms 2020, there is one mention of transport documents which has been clarified in Incoterms 2020 is that the buyer may request carrier to issue transport document to seller. This is required because at times the buyer is not aware of whether the shipment has been already, has moved from the seaport, from origin seaport to the destination seaport. So on the bill of lading, there has to be some notification to be mentioned that it has moved, and this is majorly required from their banking transaction. When there is a letter of credit opened in a bank, that time this kind of discussion, the transfer of money happen. So which is why this Incoterms 2020 has clarified that the buyer has to request carrier to issue a transport document to the seller, and the seller is obliged to present it to the buyer in full set. So this notification, this transport document is required so that there is a proper information saying that the shipment has sailed. The sailing information is there. Okay, when we talk about fee alongside ship, this is another Incoterms. This is basically used when we are talking about bulk load cargo or bulk something specific cargo which we need to move in volume. Then fee alongside ship terms are used. Now again in these terms, when we see the terms, the packaging, labeling, the loading of the goods, the export customs clearance, and as well as the inland haulage, everything is being taken care by the seller here. So what they do in a FAS is the seller places the goods at the dock. That is what is the seller's responsibility here in FAS. So they will place the goods at the dock, and it is the buyer's responsibility to pick from the dock and to load the goods onto the vessel. So if you see, there are thin lines which we are talking about. In FCA, the seller's responsibility was different. In an FAS, we see that the seller is placing the goods after the customs clearance and after the inland haulage at the seaport or the dock where the vessel is there, and from there the buyer becomes responsible for loading the goods of the vessel, goods into the vessel, and for all the activities. So the transfer of risk for the seller is over at the dock, where the transfer of risk and the cost is is transferred from the buyer, from the seller to the buyer. Now, free alongside ship, name port of delivery, for example, we talk about Nhava Sheva port, so that becomes the name port for delivery. FAS, name port of delivery, Nhava Sheva, Incoterms 2020. That is how it should be represented. The seller will arrange the transportation till the port of loading and hand over the goods to the buyer at the dock. This point is very, very important to remember. The freight has to be, the freight is correct because it's an F terms. The buyer is responsible for freight payment, so freight is correct. Seller is responsible for customs clearance at origin. So seller will do inland haulage, seller will do customs clearance, seller will do everything at origin and place the goods at the dock. Seller is not responsible for loading the goods into the vessel. This point is very important. In an FAS, we should remember that the seller is not responsible for the loading of the goods onto the vessel. It is the buyer who will be responsible. And as we said, it is widely used for bulk and large loads. Now, the third Incoterms on F series is FOB, free on board. We most of us we tend to discuss this. Even in our day-to-day work, we come across this FOB shipment, FOB terms whenever we are even talking in terms of air. So, friends, one important point to note: please advise your customers that, or the seller and the buyer, that the FOB terms are purely based on the terms for sea freight only. It's a sea term now in Incoterms 2020. It's no longer for air. So for air, if they want to use the terms, they can use FCA on both these scenarios, in the name seller's premises or the place, or not the seller premises. So FOB is the term which is especially now for sea freight only. So when we talk about FOB, again, if the seller does the customs clearance, seller does the inland haulage, seller even loads, like in FAS, the loading was done by the buyer, but in the FOB terms, the loading is through the main carrier, by the seller. The seller is loading into the main carrier. So seller, yeah.
There's a small request. Somebody wants to see the previous slide also once again.
Okay.
After you've done this. Yeah.
Okay, I'm just going back to the previous slide. Free alongside ship. This is for bulk cargo. So here we can have a look here on the screen. The seller is responsible for packaging, loading the goods, customs clearance, even in inland haulage. When we talk about inland haulage, I'm sure all of you know we're talking about the haulage from the ICD to the seaport, and when the seller drops the goods at the dock of the seaport. So till that area, the seller is responsible. But when we talk about the loading of the goods onto the vessel, it is the buyer's responsibility in an FAS free alongside ship. And all the activities after that is the buyer responsibility. If we talk about the freight, sea freight from port of loading to port of destination, and all the other charges at the destination from customs clearance and transportation, it's all the buyer's responsibility. So the points which we have to remember in free alongside ship is that the seller is arranging the transportation till the port of loading and hands over the goods to the buyer at the dock, and the freight has to be correct. The seller is responsible for customs clearance at origin. The seller is not responsible for loading the goods into the vessel. This is what is more important in FAS. And when we were talking about free on board FOB terms, here the difference is the seller is loading onto the main carrier. So the buyer is responsible for all the activities after the goods are loaded onto the carrier. So the risk is getting transferred at the carrier, at the port of loading. At the load port, the risk is getting transferred from the seller to the buyer, where the buyer is loading onto the carrier. So this is what is FOB, and it is only applicable for sea shipments, not for air. So the points which we need to remember on FOB is seller pays all the cost until the goods have been placed on the ship designated by the buyer at the designated port of shipment. Freight is collected. As we know, buyer has maximum obligation. So from E to F, whatever terms we have looked at, buyer has a maximum obligation. So seller again is responsible for customs clearance at origin, and seller is responsible to load the goods into the vessel. That is what is the FOB terms mentioned. Now we come quickly to the C terms as we are running short of time. So C terms are CPT, CIP, CFR, CIF. These are the 4 terms which is being used in Incoterms 2020. So in CPT again, if we look at it, the most important point to remember in a CPT term is the transfer of risk is still at the seller's place only, like port of loading. This is what we have to remember. In C terms also, the transfer of risk remains. However, the seller is doing the packaging, loading, export customs clearance, inland haulage, and even paying for the freight charges, the ocean freight charges paying. But the risk still remains at the origin port of loading. So once the goods are handed over to the main carrier by the seller, buyer takes all the risk and is responsible for customs clearance and other activities. So the risk of the buyer still remains at the origin port of loading on the vessel. Now here, when we talk about C terms, carriage paid to, now in this the freight is prepaid, as we have shown in the slide. Seller is responsible for customs clearance at origin. Seller is responsible to load the goods onto the vessel. Seller pays all the goods cost until the goods reach the designated place of delivery at destination. Like the seller is paying for even the freight also till the designated place at destination. CIP. Now, when we talk about CPT, CPT is also being like we have discussed earlier. Also, these are being used in all modes of transportation. Okay, so now coming down to the next Incoterm CIP, carriage and insurance paid to. Now it is quite similar to the CPT terms, but here the insurance portion is added. Now when we talk about insurance, is the marine insurance we are talking about. So here we the same things are there. The seller is doing packaging, loading onto the truck, doing customs clearance, doing inland haulage, loading onto the main carrier, and the seller is paying the insurance, freight insurance charges here in CIP. So so the goods, when they are handed over to the main carrier by the seller, the buyer takes all the risk and cost and accept the freight charges and the international insurance. So in this CIP terms, so the transfer of risk still remains at the port of loading. So the buyer has to take the risk, but the buyer doesn't pay for the freight charges. The ocean freight is paid by the seller and the insurance is paid by the seller in CIP terms. So as the points which we should remember in CIP is the freight has to be prepaid. The seller is responsible for customs clearance at origin. The seller is responsible to load the goods onto the vessel. The seller pays all the cost until the goods reaches the designated place of delivery at destination. Now, what is the change here in Incoterms 2020? In Incoterms 2020, since the seller is paying the insurance, so the seller has been it has been advised that the seller must provide insurance which covers the level provided by Institute of Cargo Clause A. Now, what is Cargo Clause A? Friends, there are 3 types of clauses in insurance. One is Cargo Clause A, B, C. So when we talk about Clause A, it is the full cover which is given by the seller in carriage and insurance paid to. Right. So when we talk about full cover, like for example, just an example for all of you to know that if there is suppose a fire which takes place on the vessel, so that is also covered. Like if you go by the Institute of Cargo Clause A if you read the clauses, you will find that it covers the maximum. The cover is a full maximum. Like when we are covering for our own vehicle, there are like premium, there are third party coverage, there are coverage, comprehensive coverage, there is a full coverage. So this is a full coverage which has been given in a carriage and insurance paid to terms. So this is what we have to remember in CIP. Now, when we talk about CFR, cost and freight, so the CFR is up to the name port of destination. So in this, what happens is the goods are placed at, it is the same like almost same like the other CIP, but here the change is that the packaging, loading, export customs clearance, inland haulage, freight charges, everything is paid by the seller. Once the goods are placed on the ship, the buyer takes all the risk. The same like the previous one, the transfer of risk is taking place at the port of loading only. But the rest is all same. Insurance is not here. It is only cost and freight up to the port of destination. It's not up to the name place of delivery, but up to the port of destination. So this is cost and freight. Now in this cost and freight, the freight is prepaid. Shipper has no control of the insurance coverage. Shipper is doing the insurance. Risk will transfer from shipper to buyer once goods are loaded onto the vessel ship. Seller is accountable for all costs until the goods reach the agreed port of destination. Now we come to the next term, which is cost, insurance and freight. We did carriage and insurance paid to, and now we are discussing cost, insurance and freight, name port of destination. Now in this, again, the packaging, loading, export clearance, inland haulage, freight charges, everything is being paid by the seller. Risk is still at the port of loading, where the risk is getting transferred from the seller to the buyer. Once the goods are placed on the ship, buyer takes all the risk and is responsible for customs clearance and other activities at destination. So it's very similar to each other, except the difference is, we will talk about it. We just want to show you a screen out here, like how a CIF shipment is, the Incoterms is displayed. Again, it has been displayed in a wrong way. If you look at the invoice and packing list, it is to Farmingdale. So CIF Farmingdale, New York. Now CIF is what? Cost, name, port of destination, right? But here it is showing Farmingdale, New York. So it's the destination part is missing. The Incoterms 2020 is missing here. So this is what is the correction which is needed here. Now, what are the points which we should remember? Freight is again prepaid. Risk will transfer from shipper to buyer once goods are loaded onto the vessel. Seller is accountable for all the cost until the goods reach the agreed port of destination, right? So seller is accountable. But in Incoterms 2020, again, they have mentioned about the insurance part. Now, in this case, in CIF, wherein CIP, we were discussing about clause A. In CIF, we are discussing about clause C. So in Incoterms 2020, the clause C is applied, which means that the coverage is less, and it is still name port of destination. So this is what is the difference between CIF and CIP, which we should remember. Now we come to the delivery terms, D terms. So we are quite, these terms have come into quite now in our trade. Starting from 2000 onwards, we discuss a lot about these terms. Now all the terms are prepaid. Seller is now in these terms, you will see the responsibility of the seller is the maximum here. The buyer's responsibility is very less in these three terms. Now, as I said, in D terms, the seller's responsibility has increased, like he does loading onto the truck, packaging, export customs clearance, haulage, freight charges at origin, everything is done by the seller out here. And even he is also responsible from the port of loading to the port of destination. And the risk is getting, and again, he is responsible also to the buyer's designated place. So once the goods are delivered at the designated place, buyer is responsible for all the risk. So basically, if you look at this slide, the seller's responsibility is maximum. Buyer's responsible is very less here. Buyer will only do customs clearance at the destination and unloading of the goods at destination. So in a DAP, the buyer is responsible only for customs clearance at destination and customs clearance and unloading. Like when the goods reach at the buyer's warehouse, the unloading has to be done by the buyer. So this is what we have to remember in a DAP term, and it's prepaid. From, if we talk from the origin to the destination point of view, it's a prepaid shipment, prepaid terms. Now freight is prepaid, like we said, freight is prepaid. Seller is accountable for all costs until the goods reach the agreed place of destination, and the risk and loss or damage is transmitted to the buyer once the goods are placed at the buyer's disposal at the agreed location. Which means that if it is, suppose, for example, the buyer's warehouse, so the risk gets transferred there, and the unloading has to be done by whom? By the buyer. The second term of the in D terms is the DPU terms, delivery at place unloaded. So in this, it is the same, almost the same like a DAP, but here again when we talk about from the import customs clearance, the import customs clearance is again done by the buyer. But the only difference out in DAP and DPU is the unloading in DAP term is done by the buyer, but in the unloading in a DPU is done by the shipper. That is the only difference. In a DAP, the unloading is done by the buyer at the destination, and in a DPU, the unloading is being done by the shipper. So shipper is responsible for all for all the till the buyer's designated place. Once the goods are delivered and unloaded at the designated place, buyer is responsible for all risk and import customs formality at the destination. So when we talk about the points to remember, the freight has to be prepaid. The seller is accountable for all the cost until the goods reach the agreed place of destination. The risk or the damage is transmitted to the buyer once the goods are unloaded at the buyer's disposal. Again, when the risk and is getting transmitted, where at the buyer's warehouse, or the buyer has told has said that no, he wants the delivery at a certain agreed location. So there the risk is getting transmitted from the seller to the buyer. And here, as I said, the only point of difference is seller is responsible for unloading the goods at buyer's premises. Now we come to the last term, which is the delivery duty paid term. Now DDP is also similar to the terms DAP, DPU, but there is a little change in DDP. Here, like an Ex Works, the buyer was responsible for everything. In a DDP, the seller is responsible for everything. The seller is responsible for packaging. The seller is responsible for labeling, loading into the truck. The seller is responsible for customs clearance. The seller is responsible for haulage. The seller is responsible for freight charges, right? And also the seller is responsible for port of loading. And seller is responsible for getting the shipment customs cleared. In DDP, the seller is responsible for customs clearance at destination. The seller is responsible for transportation, but the seller is not responsible for unloading. When the goods reach the buyer's warehouse, it is the buyer who is responsible for unloading. It is not the seller. Like in a DPU, the seller was responsible for unloading, but in a DDP, the buyer is responsible for unloading. So if we summarize DDP, just want to show that DDP is, we had showed the charges, the cost. Now in an Ex Works cost, we have seen that the buyer was responsible for everything. So similarly, when we see at a DDP shipment, from the origin to the destination, the seller is responsible. Even we talk about the customs clearance, the seller is responsible. Even for the duties and taxes at destination, the seller is responsible. For the storage charges at destination, sometimes there are issues coming in storage charges. So in a DDP, the storage charges also is the seller's responsibility. Delivery at name place, the cost, everything has to be paid by the seller. So it is all seller, the shipper for origin, freight, destination. And when we talk about the delivery duty paid, the points which we should remember is the freight has to be prepaid. The seller is accountable for all the costs, including customs duties and taxes. Now, in the remaining two D terms, the seller was not responsible for customs duties and taxes, but in a delivery duty paid, the seller is responsible for customs duties and taxes until the goods reach the agreed place of destination. So the risk of loss or damage is transmitted to the buyer once the goods are delivered at the buyer's warehouse at the destination. So the risk is always getting transmitted in three Incoterms of D. It is getting transmitted to the buyer once the goods are delivered to the buyer's warehouse at the destination, at the buyer's disposal. So buyer is responsible for unloading of the goods. As I said before, in a DDP term, the buyer is responsible for unloading of the goods, and in a DAP term, the buyer is again responsible for unloading of the goods. But in a DPU term, which is a new term which has been introduced in Incoterms 2020, DPU, the seller is responsible for unloading of the goods. So friends, when we sit in our desk, most of us put up a slide like this only, put up a like to understand what is the Incoterms 2020, who is responsible for what. So this is just a summarized sheet where it explains that who is taking risk on which terms, what is being who is at risk. Now if you see here, when we summarize, if any transit mode like X works and FCA, you can use it at by air or sea. So X works and FCA can be used, so we know where the risk is getting transferred, who is going to pay for packaging, who is responsible for packaging, who is responsible for loading, delivery to port. So everything is very, very clearly defined. When we talk about the terms which are supposed to be used for inland waterways, mainly for sea and ocean freight shipments. So these four terms, FAS, FOB, CFR, CIF, are commonly used. Yes, X-Works, FCA, CPT, CIP, DAP, DPU, DDP, all these terms can be used for sea, but exclusively for sea, FAS, FOB, CFR, and CIF can be used. This cannot be used for air. This is exclusively for sea. That is how the guideline has been mentioned. Okay, so these are the four terms, which is for sea, inland water transport. And when we talk about any transport mode, CPT, CIP, DAP, DPU, DDP, like X-Works, FCA, the 7 transport modes, the 7 Incoterms, which is for any transport mode. We can see the transfer of risk. It's all mentioned in the slide. When we charges, fees, packaging, loading charges, delivery to port, export duty, taxes, origin terminal charges, loading on carriage charges, everything is has been given as a guideline, which we normally follow in our day-to-day routine when we are handling shipments for a buyer or a shipper, or sorry, for a shipper and for a consignee. So that is all from my desk, friends. Thank you so much for hearing me. I hope this session was useful for all of you. So we can do a little bit of talking on this now.
Thank you, Indrajit, for such a lovely presentation. That was just fantastic. You kept us all awake on a Friday evening when everybody is looking at the watch, but it was a fantastic presentation. Thank you so much. So I have some questions. I'll just, if you can stop sharing your screen, I'll put up the screen. Some people have placed on the questions. I'm putting it on the screen so it becomes easier for you also to read. Some may be repetitive questions. So Mr. Sandeep would like to understand, under X-Works, loading of cargo at seller place is responsibility of buyer nominated agent?
Yes, it is, because as we have seen that in an X-Works, the seller places the goods at his warehouse. He is responsible for packaging and labeling, but it is the responsibility. He may load the goods, but it is actually the responsibilities of the buyer. The buyer is at risk from the place of from where the goods will be taken. So he will be responsible for loading of the goods.
So Mr. Uday wants to know, what does CPT means?
CPT means, as I showed in my slide also, The CPT is carriage paid to. Just want to show you again, like if you, it will be helpful for you to understand.
Someone has asked for clarification on FCA Incoterms.
Yeah, FCA Incoterms, just 1 minute, I'll show you.
Do you want to share?
Yeah, I was just trying to show.
I'll stop sharing. You can do that again, no problem.
So if I show it, then it will be more clear. That's why I wanted to show. See, in a CPT, I think now you can see the slide here, CPT.
No, you've not started
Okay,
sharing.
okay. It's still not showing, no?
No.
Okay, then I will just explain.
Have you clicked the share button to?
Just I'll just do it. First of all, let me just go to my yeah. Okay. Yeah. Yes.
Perfect. FCA.
Let me do the CPT first part. See, in a CPT, in this slide, if you just look at the CPT slide, it is carriage paid to into the name place of destination. So basically, for example, if you are sending a shipment from here to say from sitting at say Mumbai, and you want to send it to say, for example, a place called Hamburg. So carriage paid to name place of destination is Hamburg. So in a CPT, what happens is packaging. The seller is responsible for all the events like packaging and labeling, loading into the shipment onto the truck, doing the customs clearance. Even if suppose it is being sent from an ICD, the haulage, the rail haulage to the ICD port, and say for example the carrier also, the seller is responsible for the cost, and even for the freight charges also the seller is responsible when we talk from a cost point of view. But when we talk from a, when we discuss from a risk point of view, the risk is at the port of loading only. It gets transferred. When it gets transferred, when the seller hands over the goods to the main carrier, there the risk is getting transferred. So the cost is being paid till the name place of destination, but the risk is getting transferred at the origin port of loading. So that is all this CPT. So the important point in CPT, what we should remember is that the freight is prepaid, seller is responsible for customs clearance at origin, seller is responsible to load the goods into the vessel, seller will pay all the cost until the goods reaches the designated place of delivery at destination. And what is the next point? Hello?
I'll just share the screen again.
Yeah.
You'll have to stop sharing the screen.
Yeah. FCA, I think they were discussing about FCA.
FCA.
Yeah. Now, you know, yeah.
You share the screen again?
No, it's okay. I can explain. You want me to? I can do it. Okay, I'll do it again. Do it.
I'll read out the questions without sharing the screen. So you continue with your presentation.
Yeah, that will be fine. Yeah. 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 Okay, so can I continue? I'll just talk about the FCA one.
Yes.
So there are two types of options given in Incoterms 2020. Two types of cases. One is when we talk about that the name place of delivery is the seller's premises. Now sellers, for example, we take one example. I took one example of Pune or Chennai or in Gurgaon, where the seller's warehouse is present. So this is in an FCA terms, what happens is the buyer has to arrange the transportation to pick the goods from seller's premises and transfer them to the main carrier. So basically what the seller does is seller will do packaging, seller will do the loading of the goods also. Like in a Xworks, we were discussing that seller will not do the loading, or seller is not obliged to do the loading. It's not, he will not, there is the risk is of the buyer, but in a FCA, the seller is supposed to load the goods onto the transport vehicles. The seller also does export customs clearance in an FCA. So whenever there is an air or a sea shipment, we should, this term can be used when the name place of delivery is seller premises. And the second scenario is, in this what happens is, I should also talk about the transfer of risk. The transfer of risk itself is, at the seller premises, because the seller is delivering the goods where at his own warehouse. So his responsibility is still the loading of the goods. And then the risk, when we talk about the risk is getting transferred to the buyer from there, that location. But when we talk about the cost, the seller is still doing the export customs clearance. Okay, so we have to bear in mind the risk and cost, how is it working in an FCA. Now, when we talk about the second case, it is not the seller's premises. There can be instances where the buyer and seller agree that seller says, okay, I can drop it to your forwarder warehouse. Like, for example, any logistics company, they must be having their own warehouses here. So what they do is they will drop it to that name place of delivery is the warehouse, right? So when the seller delivers that, so the risk of the seller is up to that warehouse only. The transfer of risk will get transferred to the buyer from that place. So risk is getting transferred, but when we talk about the obligation part, the packaging, loading, export customs clearance, everything is done by the seller. Sorry.
Okay. So the next question which someone has asked is why FOB and CIF is not used for air freight, whereas if we actually see on practical sense, everywhere for air freight also, these are common terms. Both FOB, CIF are a very common term. So why are the Incoterms 2020? Why has Incoterms 2020 removed them from the FOB, from the air freight?
See, these Incoterms, let me just give you a little bit of guideline. These have been written by, by the people, by big industrialists, by big think tanks, and involving lawyers who have seen, by looking at previous cases, because their Incoterms are just like I said, it's a guideline. But when you put Incoterms into a contract, so then they come into place. Otherwise, Incoterm is just a guideline. So when they thought that, these guidelines are not workable in a FOB shipment for air or CIF shipment for air. So which is why, they removed it from this particular, from Incoterms 2020. They removed it, they made it exclusively. As I said before also, it took 2 years for the team to decide on the Incoterms 2020. Last Incoterms was done in 2010. And now in Incoterms, and after 10 years, Incoterms 2020 came in place. And still it took 2 good years for this team to work on this kind of, guideline. And this was kept in mind, keeping all the disputes which happens. They go through the, papers of International Court of Law. They look at the papers, they look at the cases, and then they come with this kind of situation. It is not like, for any particular reason, this has been removed by the International Chamber of Commerce. They must have visualized something went wrong in a FOB carrier. Like we also know that we can't see anything. If you go to the terminal today and go inside the terminal, what is happening inside the aircraft, nothing is visible. So probably there was no visibility, or they couldn't, find a corrective solution. So which is why it was decided to put it as a C, Incoterm. I hope this is good enough.
Sure, thank you.
Yeah.
One question we have is that there is a terminology which is more commonly used in India, which is Incoterm DDU. Though this is not part of the Incoterm 2020, but this is still commonly used in India, especially. Or
see, it is in India. Actually, I'm also from the same background like most of you are. So I know that these terms are very much used. So in these cases, what you should tell we have to educate our suppliers and consignee that these Incoterms are no more relevant in Incoterms 2020. If they really need to know, have a proper contract of sale, and if they really want to have these Incoterms into place, then these types of Incoterms should be the 11 Incoterms which have been given by as per guideline by the ICC should be used. DDU is no more existing in Incoterms 2020. So the DDU was used in 2000. In the year 2000, DDU was done, and then in 2010, DDU was removed. It was not there in 2010 also. So, this is what we as a freight forwarding community or a logistics and supply chain community, we have to inform our customers that these are the terms which are the clear guideline of Incoterms 2020, and this should be used. Instead of FOB, we should use FCA. FCA is the FCA1, FCA2. These are the terms which should be used. Similarly, DAP should be used instead of DDU. DAP should be used. Yes, if suppose there is a situation where a customs clearance has to be done by the shipper, then they should be written on the contract sale. It is a contract of sale. In the agreement, it should be clearly mentioned. So DDU, DAP can be mentioned as the Incoterms 2020, but there can be an exclusivity agreement which can be made between the buyer and the seller, that the seller will do the customs clearance at destination. So these are all the guidelines which has been given to the seller and the buyer, which one to use at which point of time for the ease of business.
Sure. Before I move on to the next question, I have our honorary secretary as well as Mr. Arun and Mr. Harish, both of them have raised their hands. I think they have more questions.
Okay.
Yeah. Hi, Indrajit, and a wonderful presentation, I must say. There are a few things which you had not clarified in the beginning, so maybe that is causing a bit of a confusion.
Okay.
What happens when an Incoterm does not specify the year? So the Incoterm comes every 10 years, right?
Yeah.
So if most of the documents that we see in general practice in day-to-day handling of shipments do not actually specify the year. So it is just written as DDU or DDP or XWorks or CIF. And it is very common, it is very rare to find people or the shippers or the consignees indicating the year. So in which case, suppose there is a contract which they have formed, which does not specify the year, then what is applicable? Is it the latest or is it the old one? Part number one. The second question of this same follow-up question on this is there an expiry of the old Incoterms? If you could just clarify that.
See, the thing is, talking to the first one, it is very much in the interest of all the parties to the different contracts in the network to ensure that the carriage or these terms are very much these revisions are happening from the ICC, right, from the International Chamber of Commerce. So these are basically the guidelines given. Now, what happens is, for example, if this year, the first portion is, if the year is not mentioned, 2020, right? So then the Incoterms is just like a null and void thing for us, right? It is just a null and void according to when suppose there is a dispute or something happening and everything is mentioned on the sale of contract, the contract of sale rather. And when we talk about the Incoterms mentioned in the contract of sale, if suppose seller or the buyer, if they don't put the Incoterms 2020, then this can cause an issue, or it can cause a problem or a kind of, an ambiguity at the International Court of Justice whenever there is a dispute arising of. So
they are at liberty to use Incoterm 2000 or 2010 as well, right? If they mention it specifically.
Exactly, they can mention it specifically, but it is always advisable. It is always advisable to use the latest Incoterms, because the previous Incoterms have been discussed, and there were a lot of disputes arising of, which is why the new guideline has come in Incoterms 2020. So it is always advisable to the community to, even if they are using an old, for example, one old contract is still going on, and with the information of old Incoterms with the specified Incoterm year, it is always advisable to to shift to the new Incoterm rules and to use those ones.
True, very true, very true.
Yeah.
Okay. Also, this confusion is probably because your your customs bill of entries and shipping bills only carry two terms, that is FOB or CIF.
Yeah,
so,
that is true.
It doesn't matter whether it's ocean or air shipment, you still have to file it as CIF and
correct. Correct,
FOB.
correct. Yeah, that is for calculation of the duty. They treat it in that manner, so they look forward to this. Yeah, yeah.
Thank you, Indrajit.
Yeah, you're welcome.
Haresh ji, you also had some question.
Actually, Arun asked the question that I wanted to ask, so good enough.
Great.
Which basically sorted a lot of things. But we still see a lot of documentation that the customers do with the FOB and DDU.
Right.
And when we go back to them telling them that this doesn't exist, or it's not right, they say it is a contract between a buyer and a seller, and how is a freight forwarder trying to tell us what to do? We know what we are doing because this is basically a contract between a buyer and a seller. This information is coming, we are basically sharing this information with our industry so that people understand what the true meaning of all the terms are. But we still get a lot of flack from our customers when they say that, why are you arguing with us when we know what we are doing? And it's okay for us to speak to someone, but when it comes to our employees, people who are on a working day to day with the customers, it becomes very difficult. So it's a very fine line. And
yeah, I just want to say something out here. Is first of all is there were some slides what Incoterms do and what Incoterms doesn't do. So when we talk about Incoterms, what they don't do is, like, if suppose there is a contract between a buyer and a seller, Incoterms has nothing to do with that, right? Whatever is specified on the contract of sale, that has to be, that is what the buyer and seller will abide by. Incoterms is a kind of a guideline given by the International Chamber of Commerce for them to understand that for ease of business, basically for the ease of business between the seller and the buyer, this has been given. It's a kind of an advisory, like we, for example, when we talk about, say, X work. Now X works, where is the risk? What kind of risk the seller will have? What kind of risk the buyer will have? That specified. And
अभी क्या किया है फैन का, अभी तो ऑर्डर किया है तो मैंने बोला था कि वो इंजन का और सब एक ही बिल बना दो.
Can you please put Mr. Vasant on mute?
Vasant, can you mute please?
Yeah. So the contract of sale is the document for the buyer and the seller. That we cannot dispute, but we can tell them that these are the 11 sets of guidelines which have been set by the International Chamber of Commerce. It has not been set by us. It has been set by International Chamber of Commerce. So for the benefit of that, it is advisable that you choose one of the Incoterms which you both want to decide, and then you put it in your contract of sale. That's it. And then that will come into place. If you're doing a regular business day in, day out, this will help you in safeguarding your both of your interests will be safeguarded. That is all we can say.
So it's usually the buyer and seller that make this contract. And
exactly.
When something goes wrong, it is our community that gets blamed.
Exactly. Exactly.
So, and this is exactly what I want to bring forth, that how do we protect ourselves when we come forward with something like this and say that, please give us the right Incoterms.
See, we can't
end up being blamed and then our invoice is being deducted.
But that is what the error and omission policy.
Yes. See, what we can do in this case is, we can only suggest them, right? So in this case, we can tell them that, sir, this is the guide, this is the shipment which you have termed as FOB. Now, FOB in here is no more existing in Incoterms 2020. Now, if you have this put in a contract sale, it is advisable that you revalidate your contract and see what are the changes which is needed. And I'm sure, nobody would like to have an old contract in place. There are also certain validities to certain contracts which goes on between the seller and the buyer. So it is always advisable that they use the correct, guideline. It is for them only, because suppose there will be nothing which will happen between them, but something goes wrong, somewhere some problem arises, then this guideline will help them, in saving them from whatever the things which are happening. Like today, like whatever disputes happens between them, they don't get resolved. So probably this can get resolved for them.
Indrajit, you can stop sharing the screen, please.
Yes, please.
So our time is up. It was a 20-minute question answer. We've already overdone that, but two questions quickly, which I'll take up. One is both on CIP actually, is that is misdelivery of cargo covered under the insurance for misdelivery of cargo covered under CIP? Would you have any comments to pass on that? I know this is the Incoterms training, but since this
misdelivery where, like which look?
I'm assuming what they mean to say is that the cargo was supposed to be delivered in Delhi. It got delivered at Dhaka, let us say. So, and it moved on CIP basis, or
see again, I will say here is that Incoterms are just guidelines here. So if you have a contract of agreement, sale of agreement made that your shipment has to reach, this is the products which you will be, sending on a monthly basis, or this is the product which is costing so and so amount, and this has to move from here, from point A to point B within a certain transit time. So and it has to reach that particular point at so and so point. Of course, that will be covered. But Incoterms are basically guidelines. Incoterms, CIP, or whatever the Incoterms, we talk about DAP, DDP, these are just a guideline given by the International Chamber of Commerce. It has no relevance to misdeliveries and all. Misdeliveries is purely between the seller and the buyer, how the agreement has taken place and what they have decided. Sometime in the contract of agreement, there are penalty clause written. There are many such industry players in e-commerce industry will find that if you don't deliver it on time, then there is a penalty which is levied to you. So all sorts of agreements are made between the buyer and seller. So in that, if it is covered, of course, they will it will favor them.
Great. Thank you very much, Indrajit. Before I hand over the mic to Vasant for your vote of thanks, I'll also request Dev and Arun to please switch on their cameras for 2 minutes. For record purpose, we'd like to have the picture, screenshot rather. And thank you, Dev. I actually have to specially thank the Clearship group. We've had the maximum number of participants today from them. We have over 60 people attending from Clearship group today. So which is a fantastic turnaround, apart from overall 295 people who attended the session today. There are especially about 60 plus people only from one company. And I'm so thankful to Clearship group for promoting this. And because this is what is required. This is what, at least I think today, Hareshji, Vasantji, and I are the most happiest because we have been able to bring in people here, and that itself is a great success. And Indrajit, it's been a fantastic session. Thank you very much from my side, and over to Vasant.
I would like to thank especially Mr. Indrajit on behalf of AMTOI for a fantastic and a very knowledgeable session. And I'm sure I think this is such a vast topic, which I think we have just covered one part of it, or the basic of it, when we look at the forwarding part or the container part. But if you look at the break bulk, the projects, that's a very vast one, which can add on to that, I'm sure, because that's also a very, and after seeing that, while I was talking, I happened to go on the net and see the book which has been launched about INCO 2020. And I said, the first thing we did was ordered that just to study more in detail. But yeah, Mr. Indrajit, again, on behalf of AMTOI, our sincere thanks to you. And I'm sure we would like to come back to you again for one more follow-up session, because we have done the basic. We have just done the basic, and I'm sure everyone will agree that, there's lots to cover. So, and very big thanks to all the participants who have joined. It's nearly 300 people around, so that was a great success. And I would like, on behalf of AMTOI, I would like to thank everyone who's been here to make this a success. Have a great weekend. Take care, stay safe. Thank you so much from all of us here. Thank you.
I also request the participants, if you have any recommendations for training topics which you would like AMTOI to take care to take any other knowledge session, please send an email to us. I'm just typing our email ID on the chat box. It is admin@amtoi.org. You can send it to info@amtoi.org. Any specific topic which you want us to cover, we'll be more than happy to take it up and present it to you, so that because that's what we are here for. We really want to promote more and more training. And thank you very much to all the companies for sending in your team today for this session.
Thank you so much. Thanks from us, all of us here.
Thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you to all of you. Thank you. Thank you, all of you.